I trust there'll be a few more people trickling in, but I want to make sure I rather they miss my presentation, my introduction than the actual presentation. So, for most of you, I believe, know who I am. Those of you who don't, my name is Antje Ellerman, and I'm Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Institute for European Studies here at UBC. And I want to welcome you all to our first IES talk of the year. I want to begin by acknowledging that UBC is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, who've engaged in learning and have been acting as caretakers of this territory since time immemorial. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to remind you that the event is being recorded, with the exception of the question and answer period. We've decided to run the event on our regular Zoom platform, so this is not taking the form of a webinar in order to make it easier to have interactions, especially during the question and answer period. But as a result, please make sure that for now and the duration of the talk that your mic is switched off or muted and your camera is switched off. That will make it easier. If you have questions during the presentation itself, if those are questions for clarification, please send them to me via chat, the chat function, address them to me, and I will ask the question. But these should only be questions for clarification. Any substantive questions you have, hold them for the question answer period that will be after the presentation. And for the Q&A period, we're going to use the raise hand function on Zoom. So click the raise hand button and then I'll call on you and you can ask the question yourself. I don't want to be the medium here for your questions. Okay, so it's my pleasure now to introduce today's speaker, Robert Braun. Robert Braun is an assistant professor of sociology and political science at UC Berkeley, and before that he taught at Northwestern University. His research focuses on civil society and intergroup relationships. His first book was just published with Cambridge University Press, and it examines the puzzle of why it is that some local communities protect victims of mass persecution, while other communities refrain from doing so. Really, I think, really important question. The talk today, which is titled Bloodlines, National Border Crossings and Antisemitism in Weimar, Germany, will draw on from his second book project, which looks at or traces the roots of anti-Semitism in Central Europe. And at this time of rising anti-Semitism in Europe and beyond, I think it's a particularly timely and important talk, and I really look forward to hearing more about the research. So given that it's really hard to do a proper applause on Zoom, we'll skip that, and I'm going to hand the mic right over to Robert.
Thank you, everyone, for coming in. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So I would like to start today's conversation by taking you to a region where I myself grew up. A region which you can see over here, located around the Dutch-German border over here. And I would like to introduce you to a man named Bruno de Levy. In the 1920s and 30s, Bruno de Levy lived over here in a town called Beerta. He was a cattle trader by trade, and once every week, he would travel over here to the border crossing in Bad Nieuweschans, to travel to the cattle market over here in Leer to scope out the local wear. And this is exactly what he did on August the 4th of the year 1931. But when he arrived on the market on that particular day, he noticed something was off. There was something different about the market. And then suddenly he saw what it was. In the left corner of his eye, he saw two gentlemen walking around, youngsters walking around in the market with two armbands depicting the symbol of the National Socialist movement at that time. For Bruno de Levy, who was Jewish, this was very upsetting, and he stormed over to the two gentlemen, together with two of his Jewish companions. One of his companions decided to to latch out to the youngsters and rip off the label from the arm. When that happened, something peculiar took place. A lot of the local farmers in the market started forming a circle around the two National Socialists and started defending them and started pushing away the Jewish traders. And they started shouting, "Jews out, Jews out, Jews out." Bruno de Levi and his two companions had to be escorted off to the premises and had to flee the market. Now, this was not an isolated incident at the time. In the following months, two other anti-Semitic riots broke out on cattle markets in northern Germany. And in the weeks after it, local business owners start implementing boycotts for Jewish customers. They would no longer be willing to serve Jewish customers who would come and attend their stores. And subsequently, a wave of anti-Semitic protests organized by National Socialist movements started taking place in this part of Germany. For a very long time, I thought I would be writing a book about how distinct socioeconomic relationships between traders and farmers and small business owners sparked anti-Semitism. But this completely changed when I was in the archives in Jerusalem and I ran into a woman called Stephanie Fischer. Stephanie Fischer, just like myself, was working on cattle markets and Jewish traders in the Weimar Republic. But contrary to what she found, she actually found that in the cattle markets in Mittelfranken, in the center of Germany, Jewish traders and Gentile farmers got along swimmingly and staged important protest campaigns against anti-Semitic actions by National Socialists and later on by the Hitler government. So I had to turn back to the drawing board and ask a broader question, a more general question. And that question is a very straightforward question. It's the question, why do some spaces turn into hotbeds of xenophobia while others do not? Research on anti-immigrant violence in present-day Europe, anti-immigrant voting in the United Kingdom, race relations throughout the history of the United States, and Hindu-Muslim relationships in Southeast Asia all draw attention to the fact that xenophobia varies across space. Given this irregularity, it's hardly surprising that many people have tried to formulate an answer for the spatial variation. People have tried to draw attention to differences in economic climate, economic shocks, unemployment. People have tried to draw attention to political discontent, political threats, electoral competition, particularly among those social classes that are losing social status. Now, I'm going to do this in this paper as well, but I'm also going to do something else. Contrary to these earlier studies, who often treat space as little containers that can carry variables for statistical analysis, I am going to argue that space actually operates as an independent force that in and of itself shapes xenophobia by conditioning political and economic tensions. In particular, I'm going to argue that national border crossings, places where two nation states intersect, are spatial focal points for xenophobia. And I'm going to argue that that's particularly the case when the nation state comes under pressure and for groups that are losing social status. And I'm going to develop this argument by looking at national border crossings, small business owners, and smaller farmers and anti-Semitism in Weimar Germany. Okay. The remainder of the talk will look as follows. In the first part, I'm going to briefly outline why I think border crossings can act as focal points for xenophobia. And I'm going to distinguish two mechanisms. Then I will move on and briefly talk about the evolution of national border crossings and anti-Semitism in Weimar Germany. And then I will dive into the empirical analysis, which is built up in 3 steps. I will first show a spatial econometrical analysis of the spread of Jewish boogeymen in children's stories throughout the Weimar Republic. Then I will do a more in-depth analysis of anti-Semitic incidents culled from archives from the Zentralverein, the largest Jewish association that was active in the Weimar Republic. And in the third step, I will return to the spatial analysis to test the actual mechanisms that I find in the more in-depth analysis of anti-Semitic incidents. Okay. Now, why do I think national border crossings act as focal points for xenophobia? And here I draw on the work of Georg Simmel, but also more recent studies in geography and anthropology to make the following arguments. First of all, and this is what I refer to as the cognitive mechanisms, border crossings are places in space that make international influences incredibly visible. And as such, they provide a lens through which local vulnerable groups that are suffering from political and social problems look at their social problems. And they therefore start construing their problems as originating in international boundary crossing forces. And it's in this context that groups, outsiders that transcend borders, become likely scapegoats. This is what I call the cognitive mechanism. The second mechanism is what I call the attraction mechanisms. So border crossings do not only change how people living near borders think, they also shape the population by attracting different people to localities. Border crossings often become symbols for international threats. And as a result, they end up attracting aggressive outside nationalist mobilization against international forces. And again, for these groups, outsiders, ethnic minorities that transcend international borders are likely to become scapegoats. Now, I've presented these as two distinct mechanisms, but I see them very much as reinforcing each other. Whereas the first mechanism makes people susceptible to xenophobic frames, the second mechanism, the attraction of nationalist movements, provides these frames. And it's these processes together that produce xenophobia on a local level. Now, before I will dive into the empirical analysis, I want to briefly talk a little bit about the Weimar Republic. With the end of World War I and the establishment of the Weimar Republic, one era gave way to the other. The establishment of the Weimar Republic finally, formally ended the German Empire and led to the establishment of a parliamentary democracy. And together with the end of World War I, this unleashed several destabilizing forces that would haunt Germany for years to come. First of all, it unleashed destabilizing forces in the geopolitical or military domain. Germany had just lost the war, had to cede all types of territory to foreign entities, and as a result was somewhat embarrassed and disappointed for its geopolitical position. This was further exacerbated by tensions that were released in the social domain. The establishment of the Weimar Republic, of course, came off the back of a major socialist revolution. And the aftermath of this revolution pitted left-wing groups against right-wing groups for decades to come. Right-wing groups started blaming the left for undermining the nation state at a crucial point in its history and blaming them for the end of World War I. Now, there, of course, were also enormous tensions in the economic domain. There were, because of the strikes that were facing the country, the German government had to sort of raise taxes, print extra money, and introduce all sorts of complicated socioeconomic policies, which often backfired. And in combination with international financial crisis, this created a really precarious financial situation for Germany, in particular in the early 20th and the early 30s. Two groups in particular suffered the most from these economic crises. So in response to a lot of the economic crisis, the government often started hiking taxes and introducing controls on food prices. This was bad for farmers, the producers of food, because they would acquire less money for the goods they produced. And small business owners saw their profits diminished by the increased tax hikes. Okay. The differences in the sort of geopolitical, social, and economic domain notwithstanding, Jews got blamed for all three. Because there were several prominent Jewish communists active in countries around Germany, Jews were often seen as aligning themselves with the communist and socialist revolutions that threatened the country. The overrepresentation of Jews in the financial world often made people see Jews as misery manipulators of money that took their own interest and financial interests over that of the country in itself. And taken together, this culminated in something that was called the stab in the back myth. Jews, because of the fact that they had no loyalty to Germany, were presented as agents that were responsible for the loss of World War I. Okay. Now, apart from changing borders and boundaries within Germany, World War I also produced changes between Germany and neighboring countries. And instead of sort of giving you an institutional overview of the history of borders, national borders in Germany, I just would like to show you three pictures. Remember Bruno de Levi, and remember how he crossed this border town named Bad Nieuweschans. This is a picture of Bad Nieuweschans before one. Okay, I would encourage you to, for now, focus on this pillar that you see over here, because you will see that as an orientation point, you will see this in all the other pictures that will come up. Now, this is what it looked like before World War I. Then this is what it looked like, and here again you see the pillar, during World War I, completely militarized. And this is what it looked like after World War I. A formal entry point that denoted both access and separation. Okay. Now, so we've seen that in the Weimar Republic, we see this uptick in anti-Semitism, and we see this fundamental change in the borders of the country. But is there some sort of spatial correlation between the two? In order to investigate this, one needs fine-grained local level information on anti-Semitism. Existing scholarship often relies on pogrom data or on votes for anti-Semitic parties to capture local level variation in anti-Semitism. And I'm not satisfied with either of these two proxies. For the pogrom data, for instance, I think it's a very extreme form of anti-Semitism that might not adequately capture lower level forms of anti-Semitism. It's also a form of anti-Semitism that requires collective action and therefore captures both mobilization capacity and anti-Semitism. And third, and perhaps foremost, pogroms also require the presence of Jews to take place. But of course, it's possible that anti-Semitism can emerge even in the absence of Jewish people. So therefore, I instead started collecting new data that I thought was useful for measuring a local level anti-Semitism. And I do this by drawing on something that in Northwestern Europe is called Kinderschreck. The best translation would probably be children's fright. And this is a very simple oral tradition that exists in Germany, but also in the Netherlands, in which parents tell their children stories to induce some form of obedience, and these stories often feature boogeymen. Okay, let me give you a very straightforward example from my own life. So when I was a little Robert, my parents didn't want me to stray too far away from the house, and therefore they would often tell me a story about the guy with the bow tie. If I would cross a certain street or a certain block, the guy with the bow tie would come and he would take me up and throw me in a well, and that would not end well for me. Now, we should not underestimate the impact that that story had on me as a person. If I now sometimes walk on a campus of an East Coast university and I see someone with a bow tie, my first response is like, yikes, I need to sort of watch out. Every time I walk into a room, the first thing I do is I scan whether people have a bow tie or not. And I've already checked sort of the pictures in the Zoom room. I think for now we are actually safe, so that's good. But all joking aside, the guy with the bow tie, the boogeyman in these stories, isn't always the guy with the bow tie. Sometimes it's the big black man from Africa. Sometimes it's the Turk. Sometimes it's the dirty gypsy. And sometimes it's the blood Jew or the forest Jew. And it's this information that I sort of use to capture whether some places were more anti-Semitic than others. And I do this by drawing on archival work conducted by folklorists. Now, here on the left-hand side, you see two folklorists that everyone knows. These are the Grimm brothers. The Grimm brothers established a discipline of folklore studies, and this was sort of a discipline that was obsessed with collecting local oral and material traditions. Over time, they trained students, and this discipline became more and more professional. And here on the right-hand side, you see one of the most prominent folklorists that was active in Germany in the 19th century. And this is a gentleman named Wilhelm Mannhardt. He was the first one who started conducting expert surveys. So he would start sending out researchers and looking for respondents who would answer questionnaires about oral traditions. This idea inspired many and ultimately culminated in something that is known as the Atlas der Deutsche Volkskunde. This was a big data collection project funded by the German NSF, the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, to sort of map variation in material and oral traditions in Germany over the place. So they would conduct expert surveys in all these small little towns all over Germany and ask them questions. Now, the work of this atlas was stalled by the rise of the National Socialist Party and, of course, by World War II. So a lot of the questions and information that they collected has remained unanalyzed. However, it is accessible. It's accessible right now well, not right now, but under normal times in the archives of the Abteilung der Kulturanthropologie at the University of Bonn. And I spent 2 summers there digitizing questions about Kinderschreck, about this oral tradition that I just told you about. And at 3 points in time, the Atlas der Deutsche Volkskunde asked questions about Kinderschreck, whether it existed in a town, and which boogeymen featured in these stories. Based on this data, I was able to find information on boogeymen in almost 20,000 different localities in Germany. And of these localities, 7% reported the presence of Jewish boogeymen. Now, what does this data look like? Let's look at this map for a little bit. This is Germany. And each light gray dot denotes a village for which we have a questionnaire. And each green dot denotes a village for which the respondents actually reported that there was a Jewish boogeyman that featured in local oral traditions. Now, as we can see, the stories sort of cluster here in the border with Denmark, the region where we just were, the border with the Netherlands, of course, the border with France over here. Then it sort of skips Switzerland here as well. It skips the border with Austria a little bit, and then it picks up again here at the Czech border and the border with Poland, of course. Okay. This is a heat map, which sort of shows roughly the same thing. Now, at first you might think perhaps just driven by the fact that Jews tend to live near borders, right? Actually doesn't turn out to be the case. So here you see sort of data of the distribution of Jews over the Weimar Republic. And as you can see, they were actually equally prominent in more central places, for instance, over here, and were not necessarily clustered in the border regions where we saw a lot of Jewish boogeymen featuring in the stories. Now, I pair this data to investigate the relationship between borders and Jewish boogeymen more systematically. I pair this data with postal maps to sort of capture where border crossings actually are. So here you see a small snippet of a postal map. And sort of I georeferenced this map, I sort of created the lines, and then I sort of demarcated places where paved roads cross borders and assumed that these are the actual border crossings in the country. And then in a statistical analysis, I compare towns that are really close to border crossings with towns that are further away from border crossings over here. Now, this is sort of what all the border crossings for all over Germany look like. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about sort of the statistical model that I'm deploying, but there's all sorts of things I do to deal with spatial autocorrelation. And I also include a wide range of controls to make sure that it's actual border regions that's driving the emergence of anti-Semitism and not other forces such as political dynamics in border regions, war exposure, legacies of anti-Semitism, economic problems in the regions. I sort of keep all of these things constant in the empirical analysis. Now, what does the statistical model actually show? So these are the results of a general additive model. And here on the y-axis, you see the percentage of villages that actually report to have boogeymen near them. Here on the x-axis, you see the distance in kilometers from a border crossing. Okay. As you can see, towns, 10%, 1 in 10 of every town near a border crossing seems to have a Jewish boogeyman. However, the further you move away from the border crossing, the lower this percentage becomes, and it dies all the way out if you sort of reach 60, or I should say 75 kilometers of the border crossing, after which the negative effect of distance to border crossing kind of levels out. So what this shows is that these anti-Semitic boogeymen seem to be most prevalent near border crossings. Now, let us briefly return to the guy on the right over here, Wilhelm Mannhardt. Remember that he was already conducting expert surveys in 1865. So as a next step, I sort of combined my data from the Atlas der Deutschen Volkskunde with his data, which is housed in an archive in Berlin, and sort of started comparing over time evolution of anti-Semitic boogeymen in these children's stories. The results are sort of roughly summarized in the figure over here. So here on this side, you see the data that Mannhardt collected for the year 1865. Here you see the data that I collected from the Atlas der Deutschen Volkskunde. And here you see the percentage of villages that actually have Jewish boogeymen in children's stories. Now, there's two things you should notice. The first thing that you see is that there's a huge increase in anti-Semitic boogeymen if you go from the year 1865 to 1930. The second thing you should see is that this increase is much more prevalent and prominent in places that are near border crossings than in places that are further away from border crossings. Okay. So that seems to suggest that between these two time periods, there is something happening with border crossings that indeed makes these towns more susceptible to anti-Semitism. Okay. Now, this is all good and fine, and it sort of shows us that anti-Semitism might actually cluster around these border regions. It doesn't tell us much about the processes underlying border crossings producing anti-Semitism. So in order to explore this in more detail, I make use of an archive of the archives of an association called the Zentralverein. The Zentralverein was the largest secular Jewish organization active in Weimar, Germany, and they were sort of a product of the Enlightenment. They saw as their main goal that they should combat anti-Semitism by informing both Germans and Jews about anti-Semitism. So they were broken up in around 650 local chapters, in which over 70,000 people were employed to read local newspapers and other types of sources to monitor the evolution of anti-Semitism over town in distinct towns. Okay. The archive is sort of split up over 3 places. So part of it's located at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Then there is a large collection that's a large chunk of the archive is located at the Central Archives for the Jewish People at the Hebrew University. And there's some that's located in DC at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. So I spent last summer going through all these archives and coding the different types of anti-Semitic events that took place that I could find in these archives. Now, before I proceed, I would like to highlight 2 important weaknesses of this data source. The Zentralverein, as I said, was a product of the Enlightenment and believed that Jews could be emancipated into Germany as long as Germany would stay a democracy. And they also kind of believed that the Constitution of Germany provided them with enough protection. That was their true beliefs. Now, you can imagine that other Jewish groups didn't agree with this position. For instance, Zionists would fundamentally disagree with this position. And therefore, I think it's quite plausible that anti-Semitism targeting Zionists might actually be underrepresented in the data that I'm going to present to you today. Okay. Another problem with the data is that the members, the 70,000 members that actually did all the research and checked these local newspapers were Jews, but also German citizens. So I think it also is quite plausible that anti-Semitism targeting non-German Jews, so Jewish refugees, is also underrepresented. So I just want to be honest about this, and I want you to sort of keep that in mind when we look at the data. So one of the first things that I did when I had this data is I sort of remember how we were initially first located here in Leer in the northwest of Germany. We're now moving a little bit down over here, and we end up in the region of Kleve, in particular in the town of Hoch over here. And what I basically did is I located all these incidents, and I of course encountered all these incidents located near the border, and I started sort of flipping them around to see what's actually happening, what type of anti-Semitic events actually happened in these towns. And the first thing that I noticed was that early on in the Weimar Republic, anti-Semitism started emerging among local small-scale peasants. In order to explain fully to you what happened here, I need to sort of take a bit of a detour. So please allow me to do that. In the early 20s, there was a huge coin shortage in Germany. And as a result, local economic associations would often produce their emergency money. They would, because they could not sort of pay with coins, would have their own little billets that they would locally produce and that they would sort of show, that they would sort of use to make economic life continue. This emergency money often had really funky designs on them, and many of them have been displayed in museums all over the world. I am now, however, going to show you some billets that have never been shown in museums around the world because they're kind of racist. Have a look at this one. This is the emergency money that a farmers association in the Kleve region produced. Here you see Noodgeld der Stad Goch, so emergency money for the city of Goch. And here you see sort of the maps flipped around a little bit, so you should look at the map, you should sort of take it and then flip it around like this. Here you see sort of the border with the Netherlands, and here you see the town of Goch, and here you see, excuse me, the border crossing, this little castle over here. And as you can see, the depiction here shows the dammed hole in the west, through which all sorts of resources flow out of the town. So this border crossing in Goch, in essence, made the nation very visible. Here's another billet. Here we see another billet, and it depicts adorable Dutch ladies, but these Dutch ladies are not so adorable. They sort of cross the border to Goch, and they have a much stronger currency than the local population. And they end up buying up all sorts of towns, every goods, all the cattle. And this completely dislocates local communities. And it's very hard for farmers because they can no longer have cattle because these darned Dutchmen basically come in, march in, and goods. So here the billet says, in swarms, the Dutch come with their strong gilder, and it sort of really has a strong effect on our community. Here you see a little police officer who chases down this giant Dutch smuggler back into the country. So again, you see how this border crossing becomes this focal point for thinking about international problems. Okay. Now, small business owners also had this same problem. On the one hand, it was an advantage to be close to the border because when Dutch customers would come in, they could charge them extra money. They could sort of charge extra, they could make additional profits. But they also saw that these Dutch people started dislocating their communities. So at a certain point, you see stores emerging that no longer serve foreign customers, only want to serve German customers. Then a third thing ends up happening. There's also all sorts of nationalist associations, radical right-wing movements that start organizing different marches near the Dutch border. Why are they doing this? And who are these associations? Now, these are associations such as veteran associations, such as the Stahlhelm, the Deutsche Schutz- und Todesbund, of course, Hitler's NSDAP, and organizations such as Freikorps units who were trying to protect the nation from further socialist uprisings. Now, it's not so surprising that these organizations actually decided to cluster around border regions because they actually, for them, the border crossing and border regions were this important symbolic thing that they needed to protect. So for the Freikorps, for instance, they saw border crossings as an important point that they needed to block off so that left-wing insurgencies could not get external support. So they would mobilize there. The Stahlhelm, they actively were engaged in limiting Dutch influences on German society. The Deutsche Schutz- und Todesbund was a pan-German association, and they went even further. They thought that the Dutch territory should be included into the German nation state. Right? So they were all drawn to these border crossings. Another thing they all shared was that they were all anti-Semites. And then the following thing happens. You have this local discontent with the Dutch. Then you have these far-right organizations coming in, and these two things start converging. The first thing you see happening is that a lot of these local restaurants and stores who don't want to help Dutch customers now become club homes for these far-right associations, and they start becoming hotbeds of anti-Semitic mobilization. National Socialist organizations also start appealing to farmers by saying, hey, we can protect you. And you get all these organizations who are mobilizing, you get all these protests of farmers which are very, very heavy on anti-Semitic rhetoric. And they are so heavy on anti-Semitic rhetoric because the main organizers of these protests often are these far-right organizations. This can also explain, by the way, the situation that we encountered early on in my presentation in the market of Leer. Because right before this episode of Bruno de Levi took place, two major farm protests organized by veterans associations, anti-Semitic veterans associations, had just taken place in this region. Okay. It's also during this time that in response to the Great Depression, farmers start producing emergency money again. But this time, the cute bonnets of the Dutch women are not so cute anymore. This time, the emergency money looks a lot rougher, and it also features stereotypical Jews hugging money. Now, I could tell similar stories about Saxony, Holstein, the Polish corridor, but I'm not going to, because I would like to spend the last couple of minutes or so returning to the quantitative data set that I talked about earlier on in my presentation. Now, remember, I've identified sort of two mechanisms that link border crossings to anti-Semitism. The first mechanism is that groups that are actually facing socioeconomic problems are more likely to deploy or are attracted to anti-Semitism when they are closer to a border region, right? Because the border makes international influence visible. If this is the case, we would expect that border crossing effects are stronger in places where there are indeed these social economic groups that are losing social status. So what I do here, in this part of the analysis, I sort of interact the distance to border crossings with the presence of these vulnerable farm groups. And as you can see in this figure over here, that the effect of a border crossing becomes much stronger the more farmers, vulnerable farmers there are in the town. Okay. The same can also be done for small business owners. And you see a roughly similar effect. If you interact the border crossing effect with the presence of small business owners, you again see that the border effect gets attenuated the more business owners there are living in a town. The same you can also do for decline in GDP. So the more socioeconomic downfall a community faced, the stronger the border effects that I identified becomes. Last but not least, I've also sort of looked at far-right mobilization. So I went through administrative records of several of these far-right associations that I just talked about. So Stahlhelm, the Freikorps, NSDAP, and the Deutsche Schützentrutzbund, and sort of looked at whether they had the most chapters. And again, looked whether there was a relationship between the presence of their chapters and distance to border crossings. And here you can see that 60% of all the counties in this particular case that were located near border crossings would have a far-right association chapter. And this affects, and the further you move away from the border crossing, the less likely this actually becomes. Okay. Now to wrap up, I started my presentation by showing you that in this one farm community in the northwest of Germany, interactions between peasants, small business owners, and Jews went sour. But then I contrasted that with what happened in Middle Germany, where these interactions actually produced solidarity across Gentile Jewish minds. What I hope to have shown you today is that whether xenophobia is driven by economic problems, by the presence of distinct social classes, by modernization processes, by political threats, is actually conditional on space. The same class configuration near a border crossing might have a completely different outcome than the same class configuration in the center of the country, because border crossings shape perception, and attract external mobilization. Now, I think this study might have several important implications. I think it sort of sheds lights on the micro foundations of theories that argue that the transition from empire to nation state has resulted to more exclusion. It sort of shows how that might actually differ via space. It also sheds light on debate between scholars who argue over whether anti-Semitism is something ancient or whether something that gets reinvented constantly. I think what I'm showing in this paper is that ancient anti-Semitic tropes and themes, such as the Jew as the wandering, border-transcending agent who is rootless, actually interacts with present-day spatial configurations in producing anti-Semitism. And last but not least, and here I would like to be a little bit careful, I also think that my argument might blow new air in a completely rebunked theory about the political geographical causes of the Holocaust. So there's arguments out there that say that Germany was surrounded by all these enemies and therefore could not form a democracy because they had to constantly fend off all these threats. And therefore they had to develop a more authoritarian structure. Now, I'm absolutely not agreeing with this actual argument, but I do think that there is something about the unique geographical position of Germany that might have resulted into the rise of anti-Semitism in the 1930s. Now, the last question, of course, you might want to ask yourself is, does this travel across time and space? You're analyzing these really unique cases, but do border crossings today still shape perceptions of people? And do they still attract outside mobilization from certain political actors and news agencies? And I would like to sort of open it up for debate with that last sort of provocative question. And although I hate to end my presentation with the picture of Fox News and Ted Cruz, but it is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was absolutely fascinating, amazing variety of sources and methodologically fascinating, but also really interesting in terms of findings. And I really look forward to our Q&A now.